The average executive, the average middle manager living from what I call the conventional mindset, the mindset that dominates all of life, cannot see what they're doing. They're living in fear. The executive is fearful. The middle manager is fearful. Everybody's fearful. And they're enacting a theory that is fear-driven. And they behave accordingly. And the systems around them are injured rather than elevated. And this is happening all the time in companies. It's happening in subways when some guy shoots 3 black people. It's happening when someone walks up and shoots the CEO of a health insurance firm. We are watching these cycles unfold, but people who become mindful, people who reflect what you're constantly studying, talking about, doing podcasts about, are operating at a higher level. They're seeing things the others can't see. They're engaging in behaviors that are unconventional but positive, and they're having a more profound impact on the world.
Welcome to Return on Empathy, a podcast brought to you by the Empathy Collective, a consulting firm that helps business leaders inspire change, one conversation at a time. We are building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a plant manager trying to humanize the factory floor, a small business owner wanting to build a strong culture that lasts, or a corporate executive striving to prevent burnout in your team, you belong in this community. Fear doesn't usually announce itself in organizations. It shows up as urgency, as efficiency, as just being realistic. The final conversation in this series widens the lens beyond individual leaders and organizational cultures to the systems that shape how leadership shows up in the world. A recently published book, Fear and Fury, traces how fear, when amplified by economic anxiety and distorted narratives, can lead to dehumanization, turning people into symbols, threats, or problems to be solved. That story isn't just political or historical. Versions of it play out every day inside modern organizations. Many leaders today feel like they are living in a permanent state of crisis. When urgency becomes the norm, there's little space left for reflection, empathy, or moral imagination. People slowly become metrics, obstacles, headcount, and leadership quietly narrows from meaning-making to problem-solving, from vision to reaction. Financial markets reinforce this contraction, rewarding short-term responses over long-term responsibility and shaping which leaders are promoted, celebrated, and silenced. In this final conversation with Bob Quinn, best-selling leadership author and professor emeritus at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, we ask what is lost when fear governs leadership, and what becomes possible when leaders choose a different center. We explore the societal consequences of leadership that never transcends urgency, and we imagine what organizations and our public discourse might look like if purpose-finding, deep change, and collective empathy were taken seriously. This is not a conversation about better techniques. It's a conversation about the kind of world leadership is quietly creating. And it ends with a question we all share responsibility for answering. What are we normalizing, and what are we willing to challenge? This is Return on Empathy. Welcome to the show, Bob. It is so nice to have you back. This is the third episode in a 3-part series that we're doing on leadership excellence to launch the newly named podcast, Return on Empathy. So it's just such a special thing to do this with you as we kind of pivot a little bit with our message and where we're taking the podcast. And I kind of want to set the stage for the audience. It's a little bit of a heavy topic, but I think it's an important topic to cover as we wrap up this series. We talked a lot about in the first episode, the twice-born leader. We really focused on the individual, the leader himself or herself. Then we moved into the collective. We talked a lot about collective empathy and the organization and how it is a living, breathing thing that needs to be nourished, and today we're going to move into the cost or the price that we pay if we don't nourish that collective. If we don't take care of ourselves, if we don't take care of the collective, what happens when that is neglected? Welcome. Thanks for being with me here today, Bob.
I'm so thrilled to talk about this.
So let's get right into it. Because you have a colleague at the University of Michigan, Ann Thompson. She's in the history department, and I actually recently read her book Fear and Fury, which was published a few months ago, I believe. And I actually read it after she had an interview with Jon Stewart, and I was fascinated by the topic and the interview. It's based on a historical event. It's very political, and this podcast is not political by any means, so I'm not going to go down that path. But the interesting parallel that I drew between the book and what we're talking about today is the topic of fear. And so just a quick recap for those of you who aren't familiar with the book. Thompson recounts the story that happened in the 90s of three teenage Black boys who were shot down in a New York subway by a white man. He became essentially a vigilante. He was celebrated for his act of violence. And the way she recounted the story, it was coming from a place of fear. There was a lot of economic turmoil happening. So New Yorkers were very upset, frustrated, and they needed to take out their frustration on something. And so this created a certain level of dehumanization and distortion around these events because of the climate that was happening in the 1980s. So what we're seeing in modern organizations right now, I feel, is a very fear-driven way of leading. And rightfully so. There's a lot happening in the world right now with the Trump administration and just world leaders in general. Everyone's feeling uncertain. Fear is a very easy place to go to during these times. And if you're a leader, there always seems to be a sense of urgency and how do we solve this problem and how do we maintain business performance in a climate like this? And that can easily, when you're in that mindset, that can easily create the same dehumanizing element that we saw in Thompson's story, Fear and Fury, where messages get distorted. We start to see people as objects of the humans that they are. And personally, I see this happening across organizations where there's literally a mass layoff announcement happening every day. And I'm thinking this is coming from a place of fear. We don't know what's happening with AI. We don't know what's happening with the geopolitical situations. Let's just be safe and cut a bunch of people out of our organization. And it's not even people at this point, it's headcount, right? They're numbers in a spreadsheet. So my question for you is, you've had much more experience than me. You've worked with leaders for decades. How do you see fear operating inside modern organizations based on what you've seen over the decades and the evolution of the way businesses are run? What are you seeing now, and how is that different from previous years?
If you go to the highest level, we have societies in great turmoil, and we talk about specifics. The pandemic turned us upside down. AI is turning us upside down. If we go back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there were a whole set of books that different authors wrote predicting the future. One of the most famous was called Future Shock, but there were many others, and they all said the same thing, that information would accelerate so much that hierarchical structures would be destabilized and uncertainty would increase, and one could go into this state of shock and disorientation. What we've watched in one lifetime is the fulfillment of those predictions. We have experienced enormous uncertainty, and particularly in the last few years. If you go back to the pandemic and then just trace the wars and the AI and all these things that have hit us so hard, we really do live, we're not on the farm anymore, a million miles away from the next center of activity, right? Even the people on the farms today are now in networks of connection with everyone else. Even the people in the far away primitive countries have computers. They have internet. If you go back to the beginning of humankind, we had very short, small humanoids, maybe 4 feet tall. Their brains were much smaller, and they lived in very tiny groups. Their connections were a handful of people. Over millions of years, we have watched a measurable evolution take place wherein they're now 6 feet tall. They now have brains that are much larger. They now have connections, systems that they live in that include the entire planet. A person in Papua New Guinea can have a common complaint with someone in Poland and someone in China, and the three of them can find each other on the internet and form a group. What we have is enormous complexity, unlike anything we've ever seen before. Now, we know for both individuals and groups, when fear increases, the system closes down. My personal attention narrows. I go into fight or flight. I embrace the survival mode. Now, the exact same thing happens to the group, whether it's a small group or the entire country. That is, the fear increases, attention narrows, we go into fight or flight and survival, and we begin to think differently. So when you told the story about, that was Bernie Getz, I think, that killed the three black youth, that story keeps repeating itself. Not long ago, we watched someone kill the CEO of the largest health system in the United States. The reaction was very similar. He got turned into a folk hero. Would that same reaction have occurred at a different period of time? I don't think so. I think when people are full of uncertainty, one of their uncertainties is healthcare. They can't get it. They can't get it right. They can't. And someone kills the head of the largest health insurance company. They have a very different reaction than they would otherwise. About a decade ago, a bunch of futurists were asked to predict the coming future. There were many things they said, but the one I remember most was the trend towards isolated communities. One of them talked about look for more gated communities that are highly self-sufficient, that include a farm, that is smaller groups trying to be self-sufficient in a chaotic world. That's a large-scale sketch of the same thing I'm talking about. So what we get during chaos and uncertainty is disintegration. Disintegration of the self, disintegration of the we. We break down. And all of those things tie back to how the human body works, right? We often turn them into other things, but they're very basic explanations of that in terms of the fight or flight reaction, in terms of how groups then react when people are in that state. So, yeah, we live in a state of fear. We see it in the political breakdown of the country. We got to a point recently where people in the same family couldn't talk to each other about politics. They felt so strongly, and there was so much conflict. Seems to be lessening a little bit now, but we certainly experienced that together in recent times. I would suggest that these are cycles. We've seen them since the beginning of time. Each time we experience them, we put different words on them because they look very new, very different. But actually, we've been going through this for a very, very long time. Just think about the fact wars never go away. We always have war. Well, that's part of these cycles that emerge and then decline. So we're looking at patterns that are very long-term patterns.
So that's reassuring in some senses, I suppose, that this is a recurring pattern and that this is nothing new that we're experiencing right now. But when you're in the middle of it, you feel out of control, right?
Yes.
So I guess my question is, first of all, before I get into how to address that, can we talk a little bit more about when you're in that crisis mode, when you're in the middle of that cycle, what happens to your leadership capacity? What does that look like? I mean, because you were talking about disintegration. I think in one of our previous episodes, you were talking about how things contract versus expand. What does that look like in real time when it comes to leading?
Let's just back it down to human interaction before we even talk about leading. In every conversation, we're exchanging information. If the slightest disruption occurs, our body records that. If I'm telling you something and all of a sudden you lift your eyebrow, and that's all you do, lift your eyebrow, my body picks that up. So, oh, she's questioning that. Uh-oh, she may argue with me. Uh-oh, what would I do if she argues? Uh-oh. That is, the human body is scanning continually for disruptions. Disruptions come all the time. In times of chaos and uncertainty, the disruptions increase in frequency and intensity. When those disruptions come, the body always contracts. It always goes into that defensive posture. It goes through the fight or flight process. Fear is the dominant organizing principle for the individual and for the relationship. So if I suddenly go there, you pick that up. Now, you may not know that you raised your eyebrow, but you can certainly see a change in me, causing you to respond to the change you perceive in me. Now the two of us are going into a downward cycle. Let's imagine we're talking about a marriage and we get into a number of those downward cycles. Pretty soon, I'm redefining you and you're redefining me. And then we get divorced. And then someone's saying, well, tell me about your spouse. And we say, that woman has an energy that every time I see her, I immediately go into this stance I don't like about myself, but I'm fighting with that woman instantaneously. Now, we've been separated for 3 years, and yet I'm still reacting to her that way. Now, we see this happen in real life, right, all the time. And it doesn't have to be a marriage. It can be any relationship. These patterns cause us to take stances where we send certain kinds of messages or signals of the energy, quality, and level, and we respond to each other. And so there are basically three basic patterns that explain all these things. One is the pattern of equilibrium. That is, you're doing something, I'm doing something, we're meeting each other's expectations. And so the pattern appears to be very stable. It's actually changing with each interaction, but it looks stable and comfortable. The other two is the negative pattern, which is the vicious cycle, the downward cycle. Oh, she raised her eyebrow. Oh, now we're separated and now we can't talk to each other, right? The upward cycle is the cycle of excellence. It's a so is the vicious cycle is also self-reinforcing. And that's why we can't get out of it. Logic won't take us out of the vicious cycle. The marriage is disintegrating. We can see it. We can go to counseling. But unless we make a deep change, that cycle just continues. It's just so hard to change it. On the far other side, the positive side, we have the upward cycle. It's also self-reinforcing, and we call it synergy. And the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. The husband and the wife love each other. They become an ideal couple. The neighbors say, if only we could be like them, right? We see excellence emerge. Now, it doesn't happen very often. Not many of the couples on the block get described that way. But it does happen. And it's just not a marriage. It's a team in the sports field. It's an organization in the economy. It's a country. It's the entire society. So we have billions of cycles, inside cycles, inside cycles. They're all moving. But if we understand those things, it gives you and I great power in the midst of the greatest darkness to begin to change things, something we're sure we can't do.
Yeah. Yeah, and we talked about that in the previous episode when we talked about the twice born leader. So I'd love to just go back to what we were talking about previously. When you're in that state of fear and you haven't gone through the deep change, you're spiraling out of control, you're going through the same cycles, and you get to that point, and let's use the example that we're seeing in organizations right now, connecting that to the incident that you mentioned where the CEO of the largest healthcare organization was shot down, the Bernie Getz situations. We start to lash out. We start to see people as objects of our frustration. And tying that to what we're seeing in organizations right now, we see downsizing, layoffs, and people become metrics, problems, or just obstacles to create further efficiency. So when you're in that mindset as a leader, what is lost?
When you ask that question, three images come into my head, three stories that I think are very powerful in terms of answering that question. So let me share three scenarios with you. And let's use the example of layoffs. I was talking to a lady. She was a first line employee in a company. And she said to me, last year, there was an announcement that we should all go to the foyer. So everybody went to the foyer. Someone stood up and said, today we're going to do layoffs. And the person read a list of names and said, we want all of you to go stand on that side of the room. So the people went and stood on that side of the room. And they said, we're sorry, and we appreciate your service, but you no longer have a job. The security officers are now going to escort you to your desk and to the parking lot. This woman was telling me the story, and as she got into the middle of that story, her body started to shake. She was telling a story about something that happened, and the victims were actually the other people. She still had her job. But being part of that process so traumatized her that a year later she's telling the story and she's still shaking. She's still traumatized. And she said to me, I'm looking for jobs someplace else. I've been doing it for years. It's not easy, she said, but when I find one, I'm going to go. Now let's back up for a second and make up the story, the shadow story underneath that story. Some executive did a calculation in the face of an eyebrow raise, that is, some external stimulus came. They said, we have to downsize for whatever reason. That executive handed that assignment to someone one or two levels down, said, go do this. Now, that's a dreadful task to that middle management person. But the middle management person is loyal and they expect to do their job. So I'm going to go do a dreadful task. Now, how do I do this? Well, I go and find out the procedure. So he goes to the legal department or HR or some staff function and says, what's the procedure? They hand him a list. Now, that list is a very interesting list of procedures. It's written for a purpose. The purpose is to protect the hierarchy. There's virtually no concern in that list of procedures for the people being fired because they're irrelevant. They're objects now. So this person says, oh, this is hard, takes the list. So, okay, I'll schedule the meeting, gets up, he makes the announcement. Now, what they've done is financially preserved the company, theoretically. What they've also done is they've destroyed the culture of the company. That is, this woman that's talking to me wants to go work someplace else. All the survivors have lost their commitment to the system. They're still coming to work. Their bodies are at work, but they're given the least amount possible to the system. Now, the interesting thing is conventional theory says, well, that's all you can expect anyway. We pay you $1 for 1 unit of contribution. Virtually no one, no accountant in the world is going to hold the executive or the middle manager accountable for the destruction of the culture because no accountant ever thinks about such a thing. They're measuring the dollars.
Yeah.
So what have we done in that case? We've destroyed the culture. We've locked in present or lower performance. We're not going to get better performance. Nobody knows it. And we all just go on with people living in increased fear. Okay, so that's the first scenario. Second scenario, I'm talking to a woman, senior person in HR, who oversaw the downsizing of one of the largest corporations in the world, one of the largest downsizings ever executed. It had happened about 14 years previously. She's now thinking about something that happened 14 years and how she had to supervise that downsizing process. Now she's telling the story, and I'm asking her questions that are deeper and deeper questions. And all of a sudden, this executive begins to shake and she begins to cry. Well, this is really interesting. This is not the first line employee. This is the person who managed the process. 14 years after the event, she's still carrying the trauma in her body. We never think about these kinds of things as we are formulating how to run an organization. Now, with those two stories in mind, let me go to a third story that brings them all together. I have a friend. His name is Ricardo Levy. Ricardo was born in South America, moved to the United States, became a successful entrepreneur, built two very successful companies, and is still a part of the entrepreneurial process with some others. He was an engineer. He was a very bright man. In building his first company, they were doing a lot of knowledge work in the technology area. Virtually everybody he hired, not virtually, but most of the people he hired were PhDs. So these are very specific people, specific skills. He personally hired each one of them. They had a very intimate, cohesive culture. People liked what they were doing. The company was doing very, very well. One night, he gets a single phone call from one of the major investors who says, we're changing our policy. We're no longer going to invest in this area that your company represents. You have 3 months and then we'll be gone. Now, this one phone call turns the man's world upside down. Absolutely upside down. He is just devastated. He spends the next week in trauma. He describes a very tender scene of going home. This is a CEO of going home, throwing himself in the arms of his wife and weeping intensely. I love that scene, right? The CEO is a human being. In the course of the week, he pulls himself together. He goes to the company, he holds a meeting, he brings all the people together. And then he says, first of all, let me tell you how I feel about all of you. Second, let me describe our current situation in great detail. He then goes into total transparency, describes what's happened, describes the facts, shows the numbers, talks about the most painful thing he's ever had to do, and that 25% of the people have to go. He does it in tears, completes the process. And when he's finished, here's what happens. Everyone in the room stands up and gives him a standing ovation. Now, that means 25% of the room, the people who have been fired, are now giving a standing ovation to the man who fired them. Now, this is a very different story than the first two stories. Now, I'm going to ask you to think about this, and you have the tools to do it because of what you spent all your time on. Tell me, what was the difference between the first two stories and the third story? Why would fired people give their boss a standing ovation?
That's a fascinating story because I actually heard someone in a very similar situation tell a very similar story where they were, I don't know how large this company was, but this other company that I'm referring to, they're a smaller company, not a startup, but still small. And a lot of the people had seen the company grow from its startup phase and, make those exciting milestones, achieve those milestones. And because they had such a strong culture, I can't remember if it was an investor or there was some sort of traumatic situation that happened where the CEO had to make a tough decision, not to do a mass layoff, but to let go some key people with big salaries. And she ended up doing it in a town hall and she burst into tears. And then everyone else started crying. And then everyone was giving each other hugs and just comforting one another. So to go back to your question, I mean, all that CEO had to do was just show up with some vulnerability and just show up as his authentic self as a human having to make a tough decision, and people rallied around him. I think what we're seeing now is that lack of humanity. Leaders thinking they have to show up and be very stoic and just, this is a business decision, we're moving on with our lives afterwards. The humanity is being stripped from our workplaces. And without that, people revert back to a transactional relationship, right?
Exactly. And let's make that point very clear. We already described the remaining culture in the first two cases, and your word describes that, right? It's transactional. What's the culture like after the incident in the third case?
I mean, they're going to grieve because everyone has to go through the grieving process, but they're also going to be able to openly grieve, to share their frustrations with colleagues, to rally together, and maybe even come out of it stronger. That's my prediction.
And that's exactly, you're a great predictor. That's exactly what happened. That is, the people who survived, the people who were still there, came to him and for days and days afterwards thanked him. They talked about how proud they were to be part of a company that would behave the way they did. Their commitment to the company increased, it didn't decrease. So this man has downsized, just as the other two had downsized. And his company is stronger, his culture is greater than the destroyed culture in the other two cases. His company's worth more money because that culture is greater and it's going to produce more money. The average executive, the average middle manager living from what I call the conventional mindset, the mindset that dominates all of life, cannot see what they're doing. They're living in fear. The executive is fearful. The middle manager is fearful. Everybody's fearful. And they're enacting a theory that is fear driven. And they behave accordingly. And the systems around them are injured rather than elevated. And this is happening all the time in companies. It's happening in subways when some guy shoots three black people. It's happening when someone walks up and shoots the CEO of a health insurance firm. We are watching these cycles unfold, but people who become mindful, people who reflect what you're constantly studying, talking about, doing podcasts about, are operating at a higher level. They're seeing things the others can't see. They're engaging in behaviors that are unconventional but positive. And they're having a more profound impact on the world.
So my question for you is, I'm going to challenge the system right now. We seem to be rewarding and promoting leaders who have that conventional mindset. This is just my observation and assumption. The CEO that you mentioned, where everyone rallied around him when he was in tears because he had to do a downsizing. To me, that's the type of CEO we need to have in our organizations worldwide. If we were to shift gears and start to reshape the way we recruit executive leaders and organizations, what do we need to change? How do we find these people and recruit them to lead our organizations? And are we brave enough to do that? Or are we just going to get back to our conventional way of hiring executives?
Okay, you've actually asked a question with several parts. The first part is about how we do it right now, how we hire and promote. I once listened to a very enlightened four-star general answer that first question. He said, generally in the U.S. Army, we have very busy senior people, and they have to promote people. And the easy way to do that is ask Does he deliver or does she deliver the numbers? So the only thing that matters is results, nothing else. Now that's the short-term narrow view that dominates hierarchies throughout the world. And so the general pattern is you promote the person who produces results. This may be the most political, self-interested, Machiavellian, destructive person on the planet, but they produce numbers, so we promote them. That means the person doing the promotion has the conventional mindset and is doing what we'd expect them to do. That is the general pattern across the planet. That same general says, it's not about authority, it's about inspiration. If I have a soldier on the radio 2,000 miles away in the middle of a mission, and the soldier has 2 bullets in, but he's going to go another 25 feet and do a difficult task to accomplish the mission. And I'm on the radio with him, and my relationship with him is based on authority. The chances of accomplishing that mission are very low. If my relationship with him is based on inspiration, and we're talking about meaning and the meaning of the mission, the chances of him going those extra 25 feet increase dramatically. Now, that's a powerful image that the person of authority doesn't even want to hear about. Why? And this gets to a second implicit question you were asking. My co-author, Anjan Thacker, is an economist. Whenever I talk about these things, he always asks the same question. If this is so good, why isn't everybody doing it? He says, that's what my colleagues ask. Now, that's a very legitimate question. Most people are in the conventional mindset, not the unconventional mindset. So if the unconventional mindset is so good, why isn't everybody there? The answer is in your second implicit question, that is, the cost of going there is very high. I'm going to be punished when I violate expectations and I violate norms. Now, most people think about that as the negative violation of expectations. When we do good things that are outside the norm, we're positive deviants. We're departing from the norm for an honorable reason. A general who takes the time and effort to be inspirational as opposed to authoritarian, or any executive who does that, is exerting a lot of energy. And they're violating expectations. And the system always pushes back. It punishes deviance, whether it's positive or negative. System calls for excellence, but absolutely behaves so that you can't be excellent. It punishes the excellence it's calling for. So there's always an enormous price to transcend that conventional mindset. So why would anyone ever do it? The answer is, if I'm externally directed and living in fear, I will not do it. So most of the people on the planet don't do it. If, on the other hand, I'm internally directed and I'm living by integrity and purpose, then what I find is there are enormous intrinsic rewards for being in the unconventional mindset. And I discover, after going there a couple of times, that those rewards exceed any other rewards. I have talked to so many people and doing research over the years who have reached that unconventional level, and they say things like this. In fact, I'm thinking of an executive who has done extraordinary things in his company. He says, I'll probably be fired. I said, what are you talking about? You've generated wealth for this company that's unimaginable. He says, I know, but I violate all the norms. And the people in the staff functions get upset. Someday one of them is going to have the right conversation with another one, and they're going to say, oh, we're paying him too much. And I'm going to get fired. The system's going to eject me. Now, here's the interesting thing, his response. That's okay. I will take my capacities, I will go someplace else, and I will bring about similar results. In other words, he's not afraid to be fired. The average manager, executive, first-line employee is terrified of being fired. That's the closest thing to physical death. So we'll do anything to not be fired, to even imagine being fired. This guy saying, it's okay, fire me. I'm not dependent upon your approval. I have power that's indispensable. It's needed everywhere. That's an incredible stance. Translate that to the Army. I have enormous respect for senior military leaders because 80% of them have made a decision sometime in their life that they're willing to die for their country. The moment they make that decision, everything changes. Their outlook, their style, their leadership, what they do, and they become incredibly attractive people. They get the job done. They're task focused, but they don't do it the way the other guy does it. Focus just on the numbers. They see things the other guy doesn't see. They're incredible leaders. Now, that same leader can get promoted to 4-star general, go to some faraway country where the latest battle's taking place, and start reporting false data to the press, saying, oh, we're being successful, and we're not. So we have Vietnam, we have Afghanistan, we have the next place. Now, this is this high-integrity military leader who's willing to die for his country. What he's doing reflects the fact that he hasn't made another step, and that step is the willingness to die professionally for my country. Often that's a step that's very related, but some haven't taken it. And I'm not here talking, this is not about the military. This is not about any specific area of endeavor. It's about a developmental model that applies to you and to me. So if we go back to fear and courage, or faith and doubt, we find a very interesting relationship. Without fear, there can be no courage. Without doubt, there cannot be faith. One necessitates the other. When I'm courageous, I am acting while I'm feeling fearful. If I'm exercising faith, I'm doing it while I feel doubtful. I can't be courageous or faithful unless I step into the land of uncertainty. And I always talk about that as walking naked into the land of uncertainty. When we're creating, we're highly vulnerable. We walk naked into the land of uncertainty. We're full of fear, we're full of doubt. But because of internal characteristics, we're moving forward anyway. We're absorbing the cost that someone in the fight or flight state, someone in the natural state, would not incur. So when my friend says, why isn't everybody doing it if it's so good? The answer is it's extremely costly. Until you're twice born, until you start to see in an enlightened way, none of this makes any sense.
And it's interesting that you talk about the cost to move into that non-conventional way of thinking, and that, walking naked into the land of uncertainty. I would also say that there is a cost of not going down that path as well. And so I'd like to kind of wrap up the conversation with a positive note. I would love to imagine a world, a society where we costs aside, risks aside, we're all moving in that direction of deep change and meaning making, moral imagination. How would our organizations look? What would public discourse look like? What would that world look like? I often think about, especially this week with the recent passing of Bob Chapman, the former CEO and chairman of Barry Waymiller. I often imagined what it would be like if all of our companies around the world were led by Bob Chapman. If we just cloned him and just put him in all the companies, what would work look like and feel like for people every day? And that's just the workplace, not to mention society. But I would argue as well that what happens in the workplace then trickles into society and the way we live our lives, because we spend 40 hours a week at least at work. And that's a lot of life. So I'm sure you've discussed this with your peers, with your students, even at the University of Michigan. What would that world look like for you?
Let's answer that question by starting at the other end of the spectrum. Let's ask what you and I would look like. That is, if we're working for Bob Chapman, you and I look very different than if we're working for that hard-driving, short-sighted, authority-based person. With Bob Chapman, in that context, you and I are more whole, we're more courageous, we're more creative. We relate to each other in love rather than fear. And the unit that we create within Bob Chapman's organization is a lot better than the same unit in the organization down the street. The answer to that question is also found in the experience of every person listening to this podcast. That is, every one of us has had a rare experience wherein we were part of a great conversation, a great marriage, a great team, a great organization, maybe even a great country. That greatness is not fixed, it's part of a process. So the country can be great at 1 minute and terrible a few minutes later. So same with the organization, the team, the marriage, the conversation. But we do experience excellence in these things, and we can describe them roughly or scientifically. We can describe them. We can list the characteristics of a great collective. That great collective has intention. The intention is moral, contributive. It has unity. The people are all working together. They're working for that higher purpose. They're making sacrifices for it willingly. And what emerges is collective intelligence that doesn't emerge in other systems. And that collective intelligence allows the system to do things it can't do otherwise. So if we go back to our downsizing story, we destroy the culture of the first two organizations. It does not have collective intelligence. It does not. It has segmented people operating independently. The high-performing, excellent organization has collective intelligence. That collective intelligence is producing outcomes that the other organizations cannot produce. Those outcomes attract resources that the others don't. And that whole system prospers when those first two organizations do not. So we can describe these excellent collectives. The more important question is, how does the little old, limited, constrained me create such a world? And the answer is, you take one step. And so what can I do today to create one conversation with one person that goes to a higher level than it normally goes to? And if I have that conversation, can I reflect on it tonight, even write about it in my journal? That is, can I analyze the excellence I created, articulate the principles that make sense to me, and then run an experiment tomorrow where I hold two conversations designed to reach excellence, and then do the same writing process in my journal? Can I, on the third day, try for three? Now, after I've done this for months and maybe years, can I change? I now have a set of principles I've internalized. They are not conventional principles. They're causing me to act like Bob Chapman. Can I change a team? Can I change an organization? Can I change a country? You know Bob Chapman's story. Bob Chapman did not start out as Bob Chapman. Bob Chapman talks about being a C student in college, going nowhere, doing nothing. And then he tells the story of evolving into higher and higher levels of functioning. We are all Bob Chapman, the C student, all of us. But we have the option of turning into Bob Chapman, the man who did extraordinary things. In fact, I think we should dedicate this podcast today to Bob Chapman and what he accomplished. But we ought to look at two Bob Chapmans, the C student and the man that we admire. And all of us are C students. We don't have to be. We're sure we're doomed to be, but we don't have to be.
Yeah, in fact, I didn't mention this, but I'm dedicating this podcast and the entire series moving forward of Return on Empathy to the life of Bob Chapman and what he did to try to change the world in a really meaningful way.
I should tell you a story. When you had him on, you mentioned the fact that I had used him as an example. He then called me and he talked for almost an hour about how thrilled he was that you had talked about him and had appreciated what he had done. And he felt so honored. And he just poured his heart out for an hour about how he felt because he was on your podcast and because of how you responded to him. I think that's something you should be very proud of today.
It's funny because he really wanted your contact info. I think you hadn't responded the first time to his email, and I had done another segment with him and you together because both of you are wonderful Bobs. And he was like, can you send me Bob Quinn's email again? Because I really want to thank him for saying those nice things about me. He even emailed me then, and it was just a few weeks before he died. So yeah, I mean, it's just, it gives me hope that there are people like him out there doing great things, who care about people.
So let me just comment on that last line. I just said that everybody's a C student. I would now add a second sentence. Everybody is Bob Chapman. Everybody's a C student and everybody's Bob Chapman. Our challenge in this life is to figure out how we make the journey where we leave behind the C student and become the Bob Chapman we already are. I think that's important to think about.
It is. It's a great point. It's in all of us. We all have that potential. And I guess that's why it's disappointing when we don't see people living up to their potential.
It's particularly disappointing when it's me or you not living up to our potential.
Well, that's right. That's the place where we can start. That's where we have a certain span of control over the way we lead, the way we show up for our families, for our spouses, for our children, and for the people within our span of care. As Bob Chapman always said, he's always seen his people as someone's precious child. And that's how he treated his employees. And now we're seeing with his death, all that gratitude coming back out into the world for the gift that he gave all those people over his time as a leader. So, yeah, I mean, I just to wrap things up, I think it's this whole conversation has given me hope that there's a way forward, that there's a way out of this world of fear that we're living in. It's a cycle that we're going through at the moment, and we will all emerge out of this better and stronger. Just like the organization you mentioned where the CEO cried and everyone gave him a standing ovation when he had to lay people off because he had to make a tough choice, but he loved his people and he showed that. And I think that's the best thing that we can do as humans is, like you said, those baby steps, having those meaningful conversations, writing in our journals, just trying to take one step at a time to move towards that way of excellence and leading in whatever capacity that we're leading in. Thank you for taking me on this very emotional journey this morning. And for sharing your insights on this topic. It's incredibly important right now and a wonderful way to kick off this newly branded podcast, because there is a return on empathy. I truly believe that. And it's not just the financial return.
Thank you for being you, my friend.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the Empathy Collective, check out our website, theempathycollective.com. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.